Hey guys, welcome back to another fun drawing tutorial with me, Miss Birds. Last class we were talking about Zentangles and how to really create them, how to set them up almost. We talked about having a nice drawn picture or starting with a square and then breaking that square into different sections with what we called a string. So as you can see, I have my large shape here. Instead of doing just a basic square, I decided to do the shape of a carrot because Easter's coming up. I have my strings that are breaking up my shape into smaller sections. So all of these wavy lines here are considered my strings. Now, in the last video we watched, there were different types of strings. So there was the curved string, there was a wavy string, there was the looped string. So whatever ultimately you decide to use for your Zentangle, whichever shape, you are going to break it up into 10 different sections by using your strings. As you can see on mine, I just used a curved string and I have broken my shape up into 10 different sections. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then the stem of the carrot is going to be my 10th design or my 10th tangle. So however you decide, or whichever, I guess I should say, you decide to do for your design, just make sure that you have broken it up into 10 different tangles by using your strings, right? So again, the string is what divides up the larger shapes into different sections, and then each section is going to have a different tangle, and the tangle is the pattern that you're going to be doing. Now, when we talk about Zentangles, we're really looking at the word contrast, okay? And contrast basically just means the difference between something. When we're working with Zentangles, we're usually working with pens. I have mine here. These are nice drawing pens and they're black. These are my favorite. I absolutely love these and I have them at home. But if you don't have any pigment liners like this or any Sharpies or black markers, you can always use a ballpoint pen. So just kind of a basic pen like this. You want to make sure it is either black or blue ink. Personally, the black works better and it gives a better contrast, right? Because our paper is white and our lines are black. So when you have the difference between white and black, because they're so opposite, they're really going to bounce off of each other. And that's going to create very good contrast, which is what we want. We want that in all of our artwork. So from now on, we're going to look at the idea of contrast and how to create contrast in our drawings or our artwork, because ultimately it looks a lot more interesting. So I'm going to be using my black pen, not my ballpoint pen. And when you're going through and doing your Zentangles, you want to make sure that you're working with pen, not pencil. Now, the reason this is because pen is permanent, right? Pen is permanent. And so when we go through and we use pen, we're really cautious, right? We slow down the process. We really focus on making sure all of our lines and shapes look good because it's permanent. We're not going to be able to erase it. And so that's why I want you guys to be using pen. Sometimes when we use pencil or other materials, we tend to go really, really fast with our drawings and we'll make some mistakes. And mistakes are natural. It's okay to make mistakes. But the whole process of the Zentangle is to really kind of be almost in a meditative state. So you should be slowing down the process of drawing and really just focusing on the design or the pattern that you're trying to create. And using pen will allow you to think a little bit more and to be a little bit more cautious of where you're putting your lines and how you're creating your designs. So make sure you're using some type of pen, okay, whether it's blue or black ink. You could even use, I guess, like a different color, like if you had like an orange marker or a red marker, that's also fine too. It's just important to remember not to use pencil. We don't really want to use pencil. So as we're going through and starting our Zentangle, we want to make sure that we are very strategic about where we place our tangles, right? And our tangles are the patterns that we choose to fill up with our entire Zentangle here. So I've actually started on this side so you can see a little bit of the process that I've started with, and then I'm going to create a couple patterns on screen. So the first pattern that I've chosen is just a basic line pattern. So if I zoom in here, can I zoom in? There we go. I've just used lines. and I've separated them just in that section. Now, because I did lines, I'm seeing a lot of the white of the paper, which is good. Okay, for this specific pattern, for a line pattern, that's fine. I could have put more detail into it. I could have done lines going the opposite way, but I like that pattern. It's fine. Okay, so in order to create more contrast, what I've done is in the next section, instead of doing a lined pattern, I decided to do something opposite. So I chose to do a pattern with shapes. One of the things that you'll also notice is that the background on this first section or this first tangle is white. And the background on my second section is black. And because black and white are so opposite, it's going to create a lot of contrast. So because these are different, our eye is going to bounce back and forth between the patterns, almost kind of ping-ponging between the patterns. And that's what you want, because as an artist, you want your viewer to look at all of your artwork, not just one section. If I were to put another lined pattern here that also had a white background, these would look kind of similar, and they would almost look like one whole shape instead of two different sections. So it's really important, and we talked about this too. We talked about contrast a lot when we did our Jasper Johns project, about making sure that you're using colors in different areas and you're separating them. That way our eye ping-pongs or goes back and forth in between those different patterns. So again, what we're really looking at here is building contrast. So creating things that are very different from each other that are alternating. So because I did a lined pattern here, or a lined tangle, right? Because tangle is just another word for pattern when we're talking about Zentangles. The next section, I decided to do a tangle that was made of shapes. And I also decided to make the background black instead of white like in this first option. So now what I'm going to do in my next section is I'm going to alternate. I had a shapes pattern here. So now I'm going to go back to a line pattern. So not the same line pattern. I want to make sure that I'm doing something different, but I'm going to go ahead and start in this section here with creating my next tangle or my next pattern. So I'm going to take my marker. I was going to tell you something else just about different weights of the marker. So you can see like this one says 0.7, 0.5, 0.3. Those are all kind of like the width of the marker. If you're working with a ballpoint pen, that's not really going to matter. But if you ever get nice drawing pens, something similar to this, they have different weights. And so this one's going to create a very thin line. You can see the tip of that marker is very thin. And compared to, this is 0.1, compared to the 0.7, that's a little bit thicker. So for my outline of my carrot, I actually did it in the 0.7. And for the designs inside, to create more contrast, right? We talk about different line weights. I'm going to use my 0.1. Again, you probably don't need to know that information, but it's kind of nice to know if you are interested in getting any type of drawing material soon. It's just a nice little tidbit of information for you. Okay. So now I'm going to go through and I'm going to create my third tangle, which I told you before is going to be a tangle with lines. So I did kind of curved lines here. What I'm going to do for this one is kind of a squiggly line and then dots. Squiggly line and then dots. Remember, a tangle or a pattern is just a design or a line or a shape that's been repeated. So I'm using line and some dots to create my pattern here. And I can always go back and add more to the pattern if I want. But for right now, this is going to be fine. So it's almost kind of like a half line, half dot. I'm going to start making my pattern so that it goes, the squiggly line goes a little bit longer each time. I wasn't really doing that in the beginning. I made a mistake. But that's the thing with Zentangles. You can kind of make mistakes and nobody's really going to know because just the patterns themselves are so distracting, right? Our eyes bouncing back and forth so many times that nobody's really going to notice the patterns or if you make a certain mistake. So I'm taking my time, making sure I'm following through on my pattern. And I'm done. So now if I zoom out using a different recorder here, So it's kind of hard to get the zooming. Okay, so now you can see I have a line pattern, a shape pattern, and another line pattern. So now I'm going to create a shapes pattern in this next section, another tangle. And I'm also going to make sure that because this one had a white background, that I'm going to do a black background in my next section, right? Because that's going to create contrast. So alternating between the background colors, alternating between lines and shapes, it's all going to make a difference, and it's all going to create that contrast. So I'm going to do kind of the shapes that we saw in one of our first videos. I really liked those. And remember, it's okay to get inspiration from a video or pictures that you see, like what we call reference images. It is perfectly fine to look up different Zentangle patterns on Google. We did that. I gave you a couple on our last assignment because sometimes it's a little bit hard and we get a little bit of an artist block, right? And that's okay. What we want to make sure is that we're getting inspiration from other patterns and not necessarily always copying the same pattern. Kind of taking it and adding something to it, making it a little bit of your own flair. I'm going to rotate my paper around. So I'm just creating large shapes, large closed off shapes here. And then what I'm going to do is color in the background. So that way my background is a different color from the previous Zentangle that I had. And again, remember that pattern is really just a shape or a design repeated. It could be organic shapes, such as these ones, or it could even be geometric shapes, like we saw an example where Mr. New kind of created a different pattern by using triangles. So now that I have my general shape, I'm just going to go in and fill in the rest of the color with a larger marker. Actually, it's not really a marker, it's a drawing pen, so I really shouldn't be using this just to color in a lot of space. But for the purpose of this activity, it's fine. So I'm just going to go in and fill in the color of my background, and you could probably already tell or see it for yourself in the video that this area here is already contrasting with this section, right? Because we have a nice white background here, and so this really nice rich black background is contrasting because they're so opposite. And so those patterns or those tangles are really kind of just bouncing off of each other because they're so opposite, they're so different. So that's one of the key things to remember when you're creating a Zentangle. How are you going to create contrast? Are you going to change the background colors? Are you going to alternate the patterns between shapes and lines? How are you going to create that contrast on your paper so that whoever's looking at your artwork is going to bounce back and forth between the different sections? Because of course, as an artist, you want your viewer to see every part of your artwork, right? We don't want to do something to where our viewer is only looking at one specific part of our artwork. We want them to see the whole thing. We want it to see it as a whole, but then we also want the viewer to kind of spend time, right? So kind of stop and stare and spend time really analyzing the artwork and see different things the longer that they sit and look at it. So I'm just going to go through and finish coloring my section here. But again, make sure that when you're actually drawing your design, that you take your time. Be thoughtful of where you're putting your tangles. Be strategic. And really think about how are you going to be able to show the best contrast. How are you going to show contrast in between the patterns, the shapes, the colors you're using. So I'm going to go through and do one more tangle on my example here before I stop the video and let you go on your own. So I did a line pattern, I did a shapes pattern, a line pattern, a shapes pattern, and now I'm going to do this next section or this next tangle into another line pattern. And I really like that pattern that I showed you the other day that was kind of woven. Remember we talked about doing the, I think I actually put it on your Google Classroom, where it's like 3 or 4 lines going one way, 3 or 4 lines going the next way, 3 or 4 lines going this way, 3 or 4 lines going this way. Oop, I think my light shut off. My light shut off? There it goes. Because it's plugged into my computer. My computer froze. Okay, so to create this pattern, and this is one of my favorites because it really looks like texture. It looks like a piece of cloth or something. I'm just going to go through and create 4 lines going vertically and 4 lines going horizontally. 4 lines vertically, 4 lines horizontally. Vertically, horizontally. So again, most of your Zentangle patterns are going to be very easy to create, right? Just using basic lines and shapes and repeating them in a certain way. And now that I have my first row done, I'm going to do my second row. So because this pattern, or this section, I should say, is going vertical, on top of that, I'm going to do the horizontal pattern again. And then just rotate. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Feeling calm and zen already. 2, 3, 4. So at first it kind of just looks like lines, but as we go through and fill up that whole section, we're getting a very nice woven pattern here. And you want to make sure that they're staying about the same size if you're choosing to do this type of pattern. And just do the opposite. Just keep doing the opposite, making sure that they're generally the same size, the same width, that they're going over one another. Because the shape of my carrot isn't exactly straight, it's kind of messing with the how the pattern's coming out, but that's okay. Because guess what? Nobody's really going to notice that much, right? That's the great thing about Zentangles. It's got such an interesting intricate design to it because everything's so different. So it's really hard for people to pick out if you've made a mistake. And they just look really, really cool after you put all your patterns in. And there we go. We've already pretty much finished that section. So now I have a lined pattern with a white background, a shapes pattern with a black background, white lines. I'm going backwards now. A lined pattern with a white background, a shapes pattern with a black background, and another line pattern with a white background. Now you don't have to do it exactly the way I did. You can go through, and of course I want you to transform or to create your own patterns or your own tangles and go through and just have fun with it. Find things that you really like and enjoy. If you are feeling like you are just rocking it and you're doing a good job and you're understanding everything and you're just ready to move on and you want to kind of just add more detail to it, go through and add as much detail as you want to your patterns. If you're feeling a little intimidated or you're not sure where to start with a tangle pattern, just go ahead and look up Zentangle patterns in Google Images and you'll find lots of different options. You can search images by step, which is what I always like to do because sometimes just seeing the pattern, it's a little bit difficult to decipher or kind of identify where the pattern starts or how to start it. So looking up step by step Zentangle pages is a great option. Or you can even look up beginner or easy patterns. So really it's up to you how intricate or how detailed you would like to make your pattern. But I will say you do want to make sure that you're focusing on contrast. So make sure that you have two different colored backgrounds right next to each other, shapes next to lines, and kind of alternating those, right? So alternating or switching them up, because that's what's really going to create that great contrast in your piece and make it ultimately more interesting. And last but not least, don't forget to use a pen, no pencil. Okay, if you make a mistake, it's no big deal. It's just one little mistake and nobody's really gonna notice. So make sure that you're using pen, slow the process down. You don't have to go super fast and rush through it, but just slow the process down. Remember, we are Zen, Om, and think of it as a fun meditative process.